Hello everybody, in case you're new here, my name is Michael Wagner. I teach at the Westphal College of Media Arts and Design at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And on this channel I talk about digital media, game design and spatial audio. Now the video today is a direct follow-up on last week's video where I made a comparison between the Dolby Atmos output that comes out of Nuendo and the output that is created by the external Dolby Atmos renderer. And if you watched that video, you know that I ran into two issues towards the end that actually puzzled me a little. The first one was that the output that was created by the external renderer sounded significantly different to what actually Nuendo created. And that it comes completely unexpected, honestly. Why would that be? And if you watched that video closely, you actually might have noticed that I was a little bit confused by that. And I wasn't quite sure if I did anything wrong and kind of made the comment that if you know if there's anything that I did wrong, let me know. Now, after the video, I went back and tried to research the problem, and it turns out that was actually a bug in the Dolby Atmos export from Nuendo. So Nuendo apparently is not perfect in exporting master files, and I'm going to show you what exactly had happened and how to resolve that so that if you export a master file out of Nuendo, you don't run into the same issue. Now, the second problem that I ran into was the fact that the binaural rendering and the stereo rendering in the external renderer didn't sound that different. And one of you, user IAMMPS, pointed out that there's an additional setting that you need to set in order to really hear the binaural rendering. Now, I'm not completely convinced that this is the way it's supposed to be. Probably is, but there are reasons why I believe that kind of at the minimum, it's sort of an inconsistency in the manual of the Atmos renderer. But essentially, in any case, it's a simple setting. I'm going to show you how to do that, and we are going to have a listen on how the differences are between the binaural rendering and the stereo rendering out of the external Dolby Atmos renderer. Couple of things before we start. First of all, if you have not seen last week's video, I encourage you to watch it. A couple of things that I'm going to talk about today probably don't make a lot of sense if you haven't seen the video before. I'm going to post a link to that video in the description below. The second thing is most of the things we're going to listen to require you to wear headphones. If you don't have headphones, you're probably not going to get the correct impression. So if you have headphones, please kind of use those. And the third thing is I'm going to make the files that I'm using today available for you to download so that you can kind of experiment with them and kind of listen to yourself on your particular system on how the differences sound. In order to get access to those files, please follow the link to my Discord community. I'm going to post the files on Discord and you can download it from there. Once again, a link to my Discord server is in the description below. And with that being said, let's get started. Now I'm going to start exactly where I left off last week, and that was this little project. And essentially what I did is I had a couple of tracks. I had a drum track that I used as a bed, and then there were 4 additional tracks or stems, however you want to call them. Those were stereo and they were used as 8 objects in Dolby Atmos. And these 8 objects were distributed in 3-dimensional space. Let me just open up the Dolby Atmos renderer here. So they were sort of distributed here. And they also had a little bit of a kind of a dimension. So they were not just point sources. They were actually kind of had a certain size. Let's just have a brief listen on how that sounds. And currently, I've set it such that the stereo is created by the internal renderer from the internal Dolby Atmos renderer within Nuendo. So let's just listen. Now, I didn't do any automation because I just wanted to find out if there's a difference between the sound signatures, or what exactly the difference is between the individual rendering options that we have. And we went through a couple of those, actually. The first one was, once again, the downmix that comes with the internal renderer. And then we had a listen to the downmix that Nuendo creates. And for that, we just kind of moved it, or we turned it into a 7.1.4 output, and then have mix convert within Nuendo convert that down to stereo. And that sounds slightly different. The reason it sounds slightly different, by the way, is because the standard settings in mix convert differ a little bit from the standard settings in Dolby. So this is something that's actually expected. So let's have a listen to that. So that is the way it sounds from mix convert. And once again, that's the one that comes out of Dolby directly. So you might notice that the surround speakers are a little bit more dominant in the down mix that the Dolby renderer creates. And once again, this is not unexpected. This is completely expected. So let's turn that back to 7.1.4. And then we kind of looked into different rendering options. In particular, many of you were interested in binaural rendering. So we tried out two different rendering plugins. One was the DVR monitor and the other one was the binaural laser studio. And let's just have a listen at the DVR monitor. For that, essentially, I'm just making sure that 7.1.4 comes out of the Dolby Atmos renderer, and then we are enabling DVR monitor. It sometimes crackles a little. I think that's where that setup sort of gets to the that reaches the limit of the capabilities of my system, it seems, for some reason. So that sounds pretty good, but the question really was essentially, can we use the binaural rendering option from the external renderer, and how can we access that from within Windows in particular? And the way we did that is by integrating an external renderer from a separate machine. So in this particular case, I have a MacBook running next to me, and that runs the external renderer. And I'm going to use that external renderer primarily only as a playback system. So I'm not going to directly connect it because, quite frankly, I can't. It's the Dolby Atmos renderer that comes with the Dolby Atmos production suite, and I could only use that on the Mac. But I can use it as a playback system, so I can create anything I want within Windows and then just kind of move it over. The workflow that I used was fairly straightforward. I used Parsec to integrate it into a Windows environment, and then essentially I also created a system where the files are synced. So whenever I export anything in Windows, it immediately kind of is moved automatically over to the Mac so that I can open it up in the Dolby Atmos renderer, and I can do that from within Parsec. So let's just have a look or listen on what we did. So in order to move that over, we need to create the Dolby Atmos master file. And that is done in the ADM authoring panel. So let's create that export, that master file. And once again, I'm putting that into a Dropbox folder that is then synchronized with my MacBook. And let's call that Atmos test master file, and let's save that, and that will create this master file. And then let's move over to Parsec, and let's see, by now it should already be over there. So let me just open that up, open the master file, and here it is. So let's open that up. And let's play it and see what the difference is. And the thing that kind of struck me is that there's actually a significant difference in the way this sounds. So if you listen closely to the bass, and once again, if you go back to the way the output is created from the, and let me switch that to stereo here, from the Dolby Atmos renderer in Nuendo. There's a significant difference, and I could not quite figure out why it is, and it seems to be completely counterintuitive, because one would expect that if Dolby certifies that essentially they have to sound the same. And if you watch my videos very closely, you might actually have noticed what the problem is, and the problem is very easy to spot once you know exactly what it is. So let's go back to the Dolby Atmos renderer here, and let's play that again. So essentially what you see here is these objects are located in three-dimensional space, but they don't really have a size to it. So while essentially in the internal renderer, let's open that up again. These objects have quite a bit of an object size. For some reason, that object size did not get translated over to the output that I'm using on the Parsec, on the external renderer. So here essentially I have no object size, or the object size is 0, and that means that the essentially the mix has to sound differently, obviously. It's Turns out that that is actually a bug in Nuendo, in the Nuendo export function, and at least I'm assuming it's a bug. It would make no sense if that's actually a feature, because the internal renderer clearly shows the dimension of these objects. Now, fortunately, there's a very easy fix to that, and in order to fix that, all we really need to do is we need to automate the object size. So that's the only thing we really need to do. So let's do that. In order to essentially kind of make that happen here, we need to essentially add an automation lane, and we are going to add the from the multi-panner. And that is a little bit, I quite often, for some reason, I sometimes kind of just pick the signal with, that's not what it is. We need to go to the 3D and take the object size. And then essentially, really all we need to do is create a point here to kind of create an automation lane. And then let's do the same thing for the others as well. So here we are, 3D object size. Let's add an automation. Let's create a point. And then in the ARP, same thing. Multi-panner, sorry, 3D object size. I changed the sizes a little, but that doesn't make a whole lot of difference. And one more time. And let's create an automation here as well. And then let's export it again and see if the object size is now actually put into the master file so that the external renderer can actually see that. So let's do the same thing again. So we're going to do the export. We're exporting an ADM file, and let's use the same. Well, actually, kind of let's call it fixed. Sorry. My OCD kind of kicks in. So let's call that fixed. And it's going to export that. And let's go back to the external renderer. And let's open up this new master file. So here it is. Just came in. And let's have a listen to the new one. And who would have thought suddenly these objects have sizes? And as it turns out, if you actually do that and you essentially create this automation lane so that the object size is actually correctly exported in the export function within Nuendo, then the output of the external renderer and the output that comes out of Nuendo are or sound exactly the same. Fortunately, very, very fortunately. So we actually don't need the external renderer in order to really kind of monitor Dolby Atmos. I need to kind of take back that opinion from last week a little bit, because you know, kind of if we make sure that everything is exported correctly, it sounds exactly the same. Now, obviously, there's a little bit of an issue there, because how do we know if the export function actually exported correctly? I found we had a bug essentially in the export function. How do we know that bug actually might happen in other places as well? So it still kind of makes sense to just kind of run it through an external renderer to a standalone renderer to just make sure that the output, that the master file is actually kind of correct. Now, this was the first problem. Now, the second problem that I ran into had to do with the binaural rendering mode in the external renderer. And in order to understand what my issue was, let's just go back to that example again. And you know, kind of now I currently have that in stereo mode. So let's just play that. And what I essentially did is I moved I turned it into binaural mode by going into the preferences and in the headphone settings, kind of turning that into binaural. The reason why I thought that is sufficient is because I enabled headphone processing. According to the Dolby Atmos external renderer manual, headphone processing, as soon as that is kind of set, it means that the downmix function is kind of switched over to a binaural downmix. So my feeling was that is essentially sufficient. But however, if we do that, we will actually hear that there's actually not a single difference between the different rendering modes, and that is a little bit unintuitive, to say the least. Now, user IAMMPS pointed out that in order to really get into the binaural render mode, you also need to enable the headphone-only mode in the Atmos renderer. Now, I'm a little bit confused by that, quite frankly, because if I follow the manual correctly, then essentially this should not be necessary. But kind of not quite sure if it's a feature or if it's a bug or if it's just something that is not really described very well in the manual. But anyway, all we need to do is we need to set that to headphone only mode. So let's accept that. And once we have set that to headphone only mode, we will actually be able to hear the true binaural rendering mode. So let's just check if we have binaural rendering enabled. So we have binaural rendering enabled. So let's listen to the binaural rendering. And by comparison, the stereo mode. And there is now actually a real difference between the stereo mode and the binaural rendering mode. Now, binaural rendering, and there's actually one thing that I need to point out. Binaural rendering is actually meant for monitoring only. And my feeling is that many of you are kind of thinking of this as almost like an effect that you're using in order to get a little bit more of a stereo feel. But in reality, this is not the way it's supposed to be used. Binaural rendering just means that I'm rendering that audio with respect to my ears and to the geometry of my ears, the geometry of my head. And that essentially means that the binaural rendering actually needs to be specific to each individual person. And if we are using the binaural render mode that comes with the Atmos system, what we're really doing is we're using a standardized kind of head and a standardized setting. And that essentially means that for some people that might work, and for some people it probably is not working. I have a relatively large head, so for me, for example, the three-dimensional impressions that I'm getting is not completely correct. So I'm kind of not really getting it exactly the way it's supposed to be, and that's the main reason that essentially binaural rendering is actually not really meant for distribution. And because it's not really meant for distribution, it's also not really that critical in terms of monitoring. So if you're creating Dolby Atmos music, the most important thing really is that you need to be sure that the stereo down mix sounds correct. And fortunately, as we saw today, as long as you are kind of creating the master file correctly, or as long as you're making sure that you're kind of bypassing or working around any bugs in the Atmos master file export, the internal renderer that comes with Nuendo and the external renderer sound exactly the same. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to post all the audio files in the Discord community, so you can download them there and you can play with them. Let's just have a brief listen to the different options that we had and how they sound. Now, in order to really be able to compare them correctly, I did the following. I exported all the different options. So with the binaural as a studio, with the DVR monitor, with the mix convert, with the Nuendo internal, external renderer, binaural stereo, and then normalized everything so that they are at the same loudness. And I did create a little Ableton project. I feel most comfortable with Ableton, I have to admit, and so that we have a good comparison. So here and these, by the way, are the files that you can download from a Discord server. So we have the mix convert version. We have the version that comes with the downmix from the internal renderer. We have the external renderer and stereo. We have the external renderer and binaural. Then we have the two binaural options that we used within Nuendo, with DVR monitor and the binaural as a studio. So let's just have a listen on how that sounds. So let's start with mix convert. And let's switch over to the Dolby renderer. Mix convert. Dolby renderer. Now, if you listen very, very carefully, you realize that the surround speakers are a little bit more dominant in the Dolby renderer version. But otherwise, they actually have the same kind of sonic texture, so they kind of sound very, very similar. So that's actually a good thing, because it will allow us to actually kind of just use mix convert. Now, if we compare the Nuendo renderer with the renderer that is the external renderer, so this is the internal renderer with the Nuendo. Switching to the external renderer now. External. Internal, external, internal, external. So yay, they sound exactly the same, isn't that nice? Now, if you let me just stop that for a second. If you are going to dig down and running a null test or whatever, please be aware that the way I arrived at the external renderer file was actually by recording it from within my Windows environment. So while they do sound the same, if you actually kind of analyze them in very great detail, you need to be aware that there might be some degradation that comes from the parsec system. So the Dolby renderer, the external renderer, that file that was played through the external renderer was recorded on the Windows machine through the parsec, kind of export. So just be aware of that. So there might be a little bit of digital kind of noise in that. But kind of in terms of the sound signature there, they sound exactly the same. So let's have a listen at the different binaural options then. So once again, this first of all is the stereo output of the external renderer. And let's switch to the binaural rendering. So this is the stereo. And the binaural rendering. Now, while the binaural rendering does give a much better three-dimensional impression, for me personally, the synth is in the wrong place. So it's kind of I think it's they are using an HRTF a transfer function that is based on a slightly smaller normalized head, but that's fine. Kind of it does sound quite interesting, and I can see why some of you are really kind of excited about the binaural rendering option. But once again, not meant to be used in distribution, just meant to be used for monitoring. And then let's do the two binaural options that we had in Nuendo. So first of all, let's start with the binaural one that comes from the external renderer. And let's switch to DVR monitor. And binaural as a studio. So Dolby. DVR monitor. And binaural as a studio. Now, I have to say, for me personally, even though essentially I do like the sonic texture of the binaural rendering that comes out of the Dolby Atmos renderer, the one that kind of is most accurate in terms of three-dimensional placement is actually binaural as a studio. So that's the one actually that at least suits my head best. But once again, kind of binaural rendering depends a lot on your personal geometry and how your ears are constructed and how big your head is and things like that. And so kind of your impression might be completely different to my impression, and that's perfectly fine. So once again, if you want to play around with those files, I'm going to post them in my Discord community. And in addition to those, you will also find the master file, the Dolby Atmos master file, so you can import that into your kind of digital audio workstation or Dolby Atmos enabled digital audio workstation of choice. And I'm also going to post the MP4 output that comes out of the external renderer, so that you have all the files together and you can kind of play around with them and see essentially what sounds best for you. Now, this is really everything I wanted to say today. Kind of if you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section below or join my Discord server. so that you can kind of chat with me directly. And other than that, one of the things that I'm probably going to look into the future is the release of the Logic Pro 10.7, which now has a full Dolby Atmos workflow included as well. And the interesting thing about that is actually Logic Pro also includes the binaural rendering mode. So it's actually quite interesting. It would be the cheapest way to actually get into Dolby Atmos. And so I'm probably going to do a video on a comparison on how that the Logic Pro workflows compares to the workflows in Nuendo or DaVinci Resolve Fairlight. But that's in the future. Until then, if you have any questions, comments, or Discord, and kind of if you liked that video, press the like button, subscribe to all the things that people do on YouTube. And other than that, see you at the next video.